We cross to SABC News anchor Mfundo Mabalane, who is live at the 5th ANC's National General Council in Boksburg on the East Rand. Mfundo, a very good afternoon to you. The ANC's Mahlengi Bengu says that, and so far as discussions are concerned, they have been insightful and robust. And of course, the SACP's decision to contest elections alone forming part of those engagements. What's expected today?
Good afternoon, Paul, and to our viewers. Indeed, that sentiment of around robust discussions taking place here has been echoed by many other delegates. But quite a busy day today, I must say. We've actually left the studio, our makeshift studio today, exploring a bit of Birchwood Hotel. We're outside the main plenary, and I'm not alone. But what is happening, as you've asked that question, 17 commissions today currently underway, discussing a number of issues from economic transformation to health, as well as science and technology. So quite a lot we're expecting, at least in the report back a bit later on. But I am joined, of course, by specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena to just unpack what we've heard thus far. Good afternoon, Sophie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mfundo.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us, Sophie. You know, the details have been quite scant, or at least we weren't getting a lot of media briefings for now. And this is something that is completely different to what we see perhaps at a policy conference. So most certainly it is understandable that not a lot, but our reporters have been hard at work trying to get as much information as they can. And just to start with you on what we heard from Samkele a bit earlier on when speaking to Ayanda. Samkele went on to state that Supra Mahumapelo is, of course, going to be chairing the International Relations Committee. And among some of the issues that will be brought to the fore is one around one state, Africa as a state, one passport, and 55 federal states. I mean, that kind of a proposition is one that would have a lot of debate. The Pan-Africanists probably endorsing it, but those that are more to the center possibly not endorsing it, looking at the regional conflict. Just yesterday, we were reporting on ECOWAS having declared a state of emergency in their region. Just your take on this proposition being put on the table as part of the debate.
Well, I think when the ANC is discussing international relations, Africa becomes a priority, and they will go back to history in terms of what was the role of the ANC during its formation as it relates to the continent. Because if you remember very well, when you look at what Seme said about Africa, that speech where he was talking about the unity of Africa, and then later all other leaders of the ANC emphasizing the importance of a united Africa. And later, during exile years, they kept contact with the African continent in terms of different countries, but also receiving military training in many countries. You would recall Nelson Mandela, when he went to receive military training, used a passport from Lesotho and also a passport from Ethiopia, and he moved from Ethiopia to Algeria. In between, they attended as observers and participants the Organization of African Unity meetings, which is the continental body at that time, now the African Union. Therefore, ANC will have to always reflect on what was said when it was the Organization of African Unity under people like Kwame Nkrumah and them, who were envisaging one Africa, a united Africa. And of course, the AU later, which was launched in South Africa, and South Africa being the first chair of the AU in 2000, what were the resolutions, so that they can always reflect and remind themselves in terms of the foreign policy as it relates to Africa, what should be the ANC position. Therefore, much as they might talk about what you've mentioned, it doesn't mean there will be a policy position now, because as we pointed out, it is only at the policy conference where you can come with changes as it relates to policy. Even then, you then take those policy to the conference, the elective conference, because it's the highest decision-making body where you adopt and then you implement. So they will always go back to history and just remind themselves what has been the history of the African continent and what the leaders, different leaders at different times said of the continent, not only of the ANC, and at that time, how did the ANC participate in those discussions? Therefore, I think it's a reflection, as it is a review, to say this is the road we have traveled on Africa, and this was the position some years ago. And where are we? What are the challenges?
But one wonders if such a proposition would garner a lot of support, given that we also heard Hope Papa today of Gauteng saying that at least what they're going to bring to the table firmly on the agenda is the issue around immigration. And it goes back to hearing Fikile Mbalula saying now they've got to go back and assess the motive forces, that the electorate is a bit disillusioned. And if you look at the electorate, for them, some of them, even in Gauteng, given that it's the economic hub, they say they are hardest affected by illegal immigration. So in as much as you have an ANC that would appreciate the role of the continent in the program to liberate South Africa, but there's also the realities that are faced on the ground by the so-called motive forces who are disillusioned and withheld their vote. What happens then?
If you remember very well, this is not something new. When the Organization of African Unity was transformed to the AU that we have today, the African Union, as I pointed out, the participation of South Africa at that time, there was a view to push for what was envisaged by people like Kwame Nkrumah, one passport, one Africa, and the late former president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, was mobilizing smaller countries to really support that, and he wanted to be the president of Africa.
Yeah.
He even tried to persuade South Africa to say, because at that time already the influence of South Africa was quite huge, was that we will give you the position of foreign affairs. In other words, at that time, the foreign affairs minister was Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and he was saying he will give Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma that position. But South Africa didn't fall into that trap. And therefore, we must always remember that South Africa understands where we are right now in terms of the globe in general and the regional organization, the continental organization, and what you can do and what you cannot do. I remember somebody even said at that time that the president of South Africa at that time said he can't just wake up in the morning and just tell South Africans there's no South Africa anymore, we are now one. So the unity of Africa, it's not only about having one continent, one president and all. It's about how you integrate the regional organizations first. As you pointed out, even the regional organizations as we speak, they are not united. Yeah. We made an example of the West Africa, the Sahel region, is now divided into two. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, now Guinea-Bissau, and also Guinea-Conakry after those coups. Therefore, you have to start with the regional integration before you can even talk about the continental integration. But also, it's something that you have to do thorough consultation. And therefore, them discussing Africa, they will always go back and reflect. But as I pointed out, perhaps at that time there was no social media, there was no lots of communication and access to information. We relied on traditional media and at times we'll miss the news. At that time, South Africa was clear that it's not something you can just do haphazard. But yeah. Secondly, you can't wake up and tell South Africans you don't have a country anymore. And as I made an example of Libya at that time, the president of Libya, who was trying to push and even trying to derail the launch of the AU in Durban. But it didn't happen. There was a launch of the AU, yes, a continental body, but countries still maintaining their independence and their autonomy, but a push to work together. Even now, on issues of trade, that's why the African Continental Free Trade Area, so that you can work together, do business amongst yourself, because you are a force to be reckoned with a population of 1.4 billion. Therefore, I don't expect an announcement tomorrow to say, yeah, now we are abandoning our passports, we are abandoning our country. It's not.
A very interesting point you make there, Sophie, that it is a very complex conversation and one that would need further interrogation, as you say, that perhaps there are other permutations, that not necessarily one Africa, but perhaps regional integration where we deal with the Anglophones and Francophones conflict and just ensure that there's a stable Africa, not necessarily that it has to be one Africa. But we'll leave it there for now. Thank you as always, that specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena.